Waging war on two different fronts right now: treatment for the sick and vaccines to ward off that next wave. The CEO of Johnson & Johnson says his scientists, they are working around the clock right now to make a breakthrough. And the race is happening in labs across the world, but not many of us really understand the process, which is crucial for building that confidence in the end product. Some drugs for treatment, they have shown promise already. That's the good news, like combining an anti-malarial drug with a common antibiotic that you find in things like Z-Paks. But then this came out today. France 24 ran a warning from safety officials who say, we don't fully understand the drug's effects just yet. 3 people who possibly got dosages have died, and they don't know what to tell the public other than just please be careful right now. And we've seen other possible breakthroughs popping up. For instance, in New York, doctors are testing an HIV drug on at least 10 COVID patients with encouraging results so far. With 2 fronts in this war, treatment and vaccines right now, plus a global race to find just the right medicine, this effort is expansive. How big? The journal Science describes the vaccine race this way, quote, broadly speaking, these vaccines group into 8 different platforms, among them old standbys such as inactivated or weakened whole viruses, genetically engineered proteins, and the newer messenger RNA technology that is the backbone of the Moderna vaccine. And their makers include biotechs, academia, military researchers, and a few major pharmaceutical companies. With so many competing forces, trying so many possibilities, and sometimes being allowed to skip preliminary steps, what standard must be met for drugs to be safe? Is the best bet public or private enterprise? I got some answers from Dr. David Gortler. He was a medical officer with the FDA and is a professor of pharmacology. You've worked at the FDA as a medical officer. You've taught at some of the best universities in the entire world. So let me ask you, when you look at public versus private enterprises, we know both are working on this right now. Which are typically the best at getting something over the finish line? We saw Johnson & Johnson is getting into this. Like you said, universities are also involved.
So typically, the vast majority of our approved drug products, and nearly all of them, come from private industry, major pharmaceutical companies. Although there are a few exceptions where some drugs for some very rare disorders come from the NIH and other places from other government entities. We are quite dependent on private pharmaceutical companies to come up with vaccines and novel new drugs to treat a wide variety of different diseases.
Could you walk me through some of these steps to get a vaccine to where it actually ends up at a Walgreens, at a CVS, at our doctor's office?
So there are people like myself in universities or in private companies that pretty much dedicate their lives to drug development. In those cases, some of them are successful, some of them are not. But once something is discovered, it's published, and once it's published, it may or may not be taken up by a pharmaceutical company as a potential candidate for a small molecule or large molecule drug development. From that, if a drug company does decide to take it on, it costs them billions of dollars, about $3 or $4 billion to bring it to market, and it may fail at some point after they've already spent that money. About half of the drugs fail phase 3. From that point going forward, physicians will prescribe it, manufacturers will produce it, insurance companies will pay for it, pharmacists will dispense it, and eventually the consumer will get it. One of the big problems we're having right now in that continuum of healthcare is the fact that the vast majority of our drugs that are being produced, that are generically available, are being produced in countries which do not have a very reliable quality control record. And I'm talking about China and India specifically. This is a major concern. According to the FDA, nearly 90% of America's drugs are being produced in India and China and other countries. And of course, the Federal Register is painted red with violations in drug production from these companies.
Since we know this is time sensitive, authorities have given the green light to bypass some of the initial phases. Do you fear that we could skip something? Like, for instance, people have been looking back to a few decades ago when something wasn't tested on pregnant women, and it turned out that was a really, really bad idea with detrimental effects. Could we go too fast?
Sure. So you're talking about the thalidomide disaster, which happened many years ago. And everyone who's worked at the FDA or in drug development is very familiar with that disaster. In the case we're in right now, there are some rules of the FDA which I understand have to be suspended, and I agree with what the FDA is doing because people are dying. And so while you're right, there could potentially be safety issues with this drug. At this point, because this disease is so virulent and so dangerous, we really don't have a choice, and we don't have time to do longer safety testing, unfortunately.
I don't have to tell you that there are many millions of people who are skeptical about vaccines as is. A brand new vaccine potentially coming to market in the next 9 to, let's say, 18 months. How likely is it that we're going to have to take that on faith?
I do believe there's a lot of reason to be optimistic, but scientists like myself who've dedicated their life to drug development and letting patients have safe drugs, I think it's very important to examine those data very, very carefully, especially in the existing situation, in order to understand whether these drugs will work concretely. We have to know whether they work, because otherwise they could actually just be doing harm if used incorrectly. We're all very hopeful that this combination will be fruitful and help people, and we're also very hopeful, scientists like myself, that eventually there'll be a vaccine so people won't even contract this disease.
Dr. David Gortler, thank you.
Thank you very much.
This effort to create a vaccine is truly global. We're going to keep tabs on it for you with regular updates right here on Newsy. Ahead, what it's like to deliver a baby in the age of